If you grew up near the Appalachian Mountains, you already know. Folks don't just make up stories out here, they remember them. I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it right now? Drop it in the comments. It's wild how many of us are sitting in the dark, listening to the same story, scattered across different corners of the country. Hit the like button and subscribe. It helps more people find their way into these woods, whether they should or not. Let's start. My name's Daniel. I'm 32, a substitute teacher who can't seem to land anything permanent, which means I say yes to almost any excuse to leave town. The cabin trip was Nate's idea, though calling it his cabin was generous. It actually belonged to his aunt, a woman who everyone in his family described as strange, and who hadn't been seen in church for 20 years. He swore she lived off some inheritance and kept to herself in the woods near Laurel Fork, tucked into a stretch of the Appalachian foothills that most maps forgot. I'd been teaching back-to-back late-night GED prep classes at the community center, stumbling home at sunrise, sleeping through the day like a vampire without a castle. When Nate offered a weekend away, I didn't hesitate. I figured even rotting wood and bad plumbing would beat the fluorescent hum of my apartment. It was supposed to be 4 of us, Nate, me, our friend Clara, and Clara's new boyfriend Ryan. But Clara texted last minute that her boss needed her to cover the Saturday shift. She and Ryan promised they'd drive up the next morning. That left Nate and me to head out first. Nate's car was barely holding together, an old Honda Civic with mismatched hubcaps and a trunk that only stayed shut with bungee cords. We drove past the edge of town, through a place called Briar Hollow that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1950s, then onto county roads that twisted deeper into pine and poplar forest. By the time the pavement gave way to gravel, the world outside had thinned into pure woods. The road narrowed until the trees leaned, so close it felt like we were being swallowed. Almost there, Nate muttered for the 5th time, though he sounded like he was trying to convince himself. The cabin appeared after a bend, slumped at the edge of a clearing like it had been dropped there and forgotten. A single-story rectangle of blackened logs, with a porch that sagged in the middle and windows dull with grime. The place looked abandoned, yet not abandoned enough, like someone had stepped out and never returned. Inside smelled of dust and mildew. A wood stove squatted in the corner. An old water pump sat in the kitchen sink, with instructions taped to the wall in shaky handwriting. Prime first, or it won't run. We found mason jars lined along one shelf, cloudy with whatever they'd once held. There was no cell service. Nate said he could sometimes get a flicker of a bar if he stood on the roof and waved his phone in the air like a weather vane. We didn't have much in the way of supplies. Cheap beer, canned soup, and a duffel bag full of VHS tapes Nate had dug out of his dad's attic. He'd even lugged up a VCR and a tiny box television, heavy as a cinder block. I claimed the couch while he dumped his gear in the bedroom. We cracked beers, laughed at the stiff dubbing of a kung fu tape, and by midnight we were both passed out. I woke sometime after 3. The generator had gone quiet, and the silence felt thick, as if the woods had stuffed my ears. My watch glowed faintly when I tapped it, 3:17 a.m. Then it came, 3 dull thuds from the wall behind the couch. Not sharp like a branch hitting, not hollow like an animal scurrying, just deliberate. I froze. Nate kept snoring in the other room. My mouth had gone dry. A minute later came another knock, same pace, same weight. Then silence. I didn't sleep again. The hours crawled until a pale fog pressed against the windows. When I stepped outside, I noticed something I hadn't before. A narrow break in the tree line, like a deer path, sloping down into shadows. Too narrow for a hunter's trail, too straight for something wild. I asked Nate about it over burnt coffee. He frowned. No clue. My aunt didn't explain much. She just said we could use the place. Around noon, Clara texted they were on the way, said they'd be up in a few hours. That was the last we heard. By evening, unease had crept over us like damp air. Nate climbed onto the roof to try for a signal. I told him not to worry, maybe Clara and Ryan got held up. But my stomach kept twisting. The woods didn't feel still, they felt like they were waiting. That night the generator sputtered out again. I heard the back door creak, then shut. I thought Nate was fixing it until I checked his room. Empty. Sheets rumpled, but no Nate. My heart thudded. I grabbed the flashlight, opened the back door. The clearing was still under moonlight. I swept the beam across the trees, and something shifted. A figure slipped behind a trunk, too small to be Nate, too low to the ground. My throat locked. The light flickered as if the batteries hated me. I whispered, "Nate?" but nothing answered. When he stumbled back inside 10 minutes later, drenched in sweat, I demanded where he'd been. "I thought I saw Clara," he panted. "Out by the trees." I yelled, "Didn't you hear me?" He shook his head when I asked how far he went. "Not far. Just enough to see it wasn't her." His eyes were wide, haunted. The next morning, something new hung above the back steps. Tin cans tied with scarlet yarn, clinking together in the breeze. Wind chimes, but wrong. Nate ripped them down and threw them into the fire pit, like breaking them might erase what we'd seen. By nightfall, no sign of Clara or Ryan. Nate climbed the roof again. I sat by the wood stove, pretending to read, but my eyes kept darting to the window. Then came the knocks again. This time 5 slow measured against the far side of the cabin. We froze. 5 more against the back door. Nate grabbed the fire poker, and I begged him not to open it. He did anyway. The clearing stood empty until I saw fingers. Pale, spidery, curling around the edge of a trunk. Motionless. Watching. I screamed. Nate slammed the door shut. That broke whatever spell had held us. We shoved our bags together, piled into his Civic, and tore down the gravel path. The headlights caught on trees as we passed, and my blood ran cold. From one branch hung not 3 cans, but dozens, rows of them, swaying though no wind stirred. 2 miles out, we found Clara's car. Parked crooked, driver's door yawning open, lights off. Inside, her phone lay shattered on the seat. Ryan's jacket was folded strangely in the back, like someone had set it down with care. Nate slowed, but I shouted until he pressed the gas and we sped past. Neither of us spoke for the rest of the drive. The next morning, Clara's parents called the cops. Search teams found the car, the broken phone. But not them. Not even tracks. Nate hasn't said a word about that night since, but I can't stop replaying it. Because here's the part one didn't tell the police. When we left the cabin, just before the road curved, I looked back. There was someone standing on the porch. Not Clara, not Ryan, not Nate's aunt. Taller, too tall. Their head almost brushing the porch roof, watching us leave. And sometimes, in the still hours after 3 a.m., I swear I hear it again. That dull, deliberate knock. As if it learned where I live. I'm 29, a nurse out of Charleston who was running on fumes by the time last fall rolled around. My shifts at the hospital had stacked into a blur of fluorescent lights and endless alarms. Heart monitors, pagers, patients screaming, families crying. Sometimes I swore I could still hear the beeping when I lay down in my bed. Sleep hadn't come easy for weeks, and even when I managed a couple hours, I'd wake up with clenched teeth and my jaw aching like I'd been fighting myself. I knew I needed a break before I broke. The cabin wasn't my idea. My cousin Shane worked construction in Tennessee and knew a guy who supposedly had this hunting place near Tug Fork, right along the Kentucky-West Virginia border. The kind of backwoods getaway that didn't show up on Airbnb or Google Maps. Shane scribbled a number on a scrap of drywall packaging, told me, "Call this fella, send him $50 to hold the place, and it's yours for the weekend." No contract, no photos, no real directions, just landmarks like, drive till you see the black barn with a Confederate flag on the roof, then keep right until the pavement disappears. It sounded reckless. It sounded perfect. I left after a Friday shift, still in scrubs, tossing a bag of clothes and a paperback into the trunk of my Camry. Charleston's noise gave way to winding roads and ridges that cut off the radio until it was just me and the whine of the tires. Past midnight the GPS quit on me, stuck spinning like it was embarrassed to admit it had no idea where I was. I switched to the hand-drawn map Shane had passed along, full of crooked arrows and notes like turn where the fence post leans and veer right after the gas pump graveyard. I laughed at first, then the asphalt crumbled to gravel, and the trees pressed so close my high beams painted them into a wall. The Camry's undercarriage scraped rocks. The road felt like it wasn't supposed to be there, like it had been carved out by something dragging claws instead of machines. When the clearing finally opened, my chest unknotted until I saw the cabin. It wasn't much bigger than a tool shed, the logs dark with rot. the roof sagging in the middle as though it were bowing under some invisible weight. Two windows stared like clouded eyes. A porch leaned to one side, littered with pine needles and a rusted lantern. It looked like a place that had been waiting to be forgotten. But the silence, that's what I noticed most. No frogs, no crickets, not even the wind. It was the kind of quiet that swallows your own breathing. Inside was one room, for walls holding more shadow than light. A bed frame crouched in the corner, mattress thin as a tongue. A stovepipe tilted in the corner. A kitchenette with a square fridge that rattled when I opened it. And the locks, if you could call them that, were nothing more than little brass hooks. No bolts, no chains. The floor complained with every step. The air had that coppery tang of damp wood. I told myself this was fine. I wanted away from people, and I'd gotten exactly that. I made a fire with the matches left on the counter, choked on smoke until the logs decided to catch. Ate the sad turkey sandwich I'd bought at a gas station 3 towns back. Tried to read, but the words on the page slid off my brain like rain down glass. I gave up and crawled into bed with the curtains open. No one out there to peek in, just stars and trees. But the silence pressed too hard. Every little creak in the wood sounded like it had been aimed directly at me. Then sometime after midnight, I heard it, a clicking noise. At first it was faint, irregular, tick, 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 like someone snapping their fingernails against wood, or a tongue trying to imitate the sound. It stopped whenever I sat up. Started again when I tried to relax. I buried my head under the blanket, told myself it was just a bug. Later, I woke with my bladder aching. The clock on my phone read 2:11 a.m. No service, battery already low. I slipped into my shoes, grabbed the flashlight, and stepped into the cold. My breath smoked in the beam. The trees stood like black ribs around the clearing. I walked a little past the porch, did my business, and zipped up. That's when I heard it again, click. Only closer. I froze, killed the flashlight. The silence felt heavier now. After half a minute, I clicked the light back on. Nothing. No eyeshine, no movement. Just the trees pretending to be empty. I hustled back inside, latched the hook, and crawled under the blanket fully dressed. My hands were still shaking when I heard it again. Click, this time from inside. Behind me, I turned the flashlight slowly, expecting to see a mouse or bug. Nothing. The sound stopped. I lowered the light, and then it started again, softer, from beneath the floorboards. Click, 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 deliberate, as if spelling something I didn't know how to read. There was a hatch I'd noticed earlier, nailed shut near the back steps. A crawl space. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. Knife on the pillow, flashlight clutched in my fist, staring at the floor until sunrise. In daylight, it all felt foolish. Sleep-deprived paranoia, maybe. But when I stepped outside, my stomach dropped. The dirt around the cabin was marked. Footprints. Not boots, not shoes. Bare. Wide. Toes long and too many, splayed like a hand pressed upside down into the earth. They circled the cabin. Stopped at the windows. Paused at the porch. I crouched to study one, and the soil was crushed deeper than any normal weight could manage. I couldn't even see a heel, just toes, like something pulling itself forward on grasping feet. I climbed a ridge until I got a flicker of service and texted Shane. "Hey, anyone else have a key out here?" He replied after a long pause, "Only you." "Why?" I didn't answer. The second night, I barred the doors with whatever I could find, wedged the chair under the front latch, piled the cooler and my bag against the back, slept in my jeans with the knife open and the flashlight on. The sound started earlier, not clicking this time, whispering. It rose from beneath the boards, low and broken, like a throat forcing words it had never learned to shape. Not English, not language, just syllables stitched together wrong. Ta rutana. The cadence was all off, like a child mocking speech without knowing how it worked. I stood in the corner, crouched low, blade trembling in my hand. The whisper thickened into a groan, long, wet, and wrong, like someone trying to exhale through a mouth that wasn't meant to open. When dawn finally thinned the dark, the sound stopped. I stumbled outside, desperate for proof it was just my imagination. But the ground was marked again. The same wide, finger-like tracks, circling, leading to the back door. And this time, they didn't lead away. I shoved everything into my bag, threw it in the car, and bolted. My hands shook so bad on the wheel I nearly slid into a ditch. Gravel spat out behind me as I floored it down the mountain path. About a mile out, I stopped to breathe, to prove I wasn't losing it. I popped the trunk to make sure I hadn't left anything behind. And there it was, for smears across the inside of the trunk lid. Black, oily, thick as fingers dragged in tar. No smell, no texture I recognized, just stains gleaming in the light. I slammed the trunk and drove until the road turned back to pavement, until my phone chirped alive with a bar of service. I tried searching for that cabin later. Couldn't find it on any map. Couldn't find Shane's buddy, either, like he'd never existed. Shane swore he'd lost contact. Stopped answering when I pressed. That was months ago. But sometimes when I wake between shifts, always around 2 o'clock or 3 a.m., I hear it again. That click, coming from the vents, from the pipes, from somewhere beneath the floor of my apartment. I asked an older nurse once, half joking, if she'd ever heard of anything strange out near Tug 4. Her face went still, and she said, "They call them hollow tongues. Things that live under cabins, mimic voices till they learn yours." She told me to stop listening when it tries, because once it can say your name, it doesn't stop coming. I laughed it off at the time, but last week, as I was trying to drift off, I heard it again, low, dragging, shaping the syllables. Melissa, and I don't know if I'll ever sleep again. My name is Jordan. I was 31 that summer, freshly out of a teaching job that had drained every ounce of energy I had. The district was cutting staff left and right, and my contract hadn't been renewed. I didn't have the money to celebrate or the strength to wallow, so when my cousin Marcus suggested a cabin trip, I said yes before he'd even finished explaining. Think of it as a reset, he told me. No emails, no bosses, just woods, beer, and quiet. I figured why not? A break from resumes and rejection letters sounded good. He said it was called Briar Run Lodge, somewhere in the higher ridges above New River Gorge, an area I didn't know much about aside from the fact it was remote. He found the listing on some sketchy site that looked like it hadn't been updated since 2005. The photos were grainy, the kind where you couldn't tell if you were looking at shadow or mold. The reviews were all one-liners, very private. Quiet place. Not for everyone. Not exactly reassuring, but not alarming either. There were 5 of us in the group, me, Marcus, his girlfriend Holly, and 2 of his college buddies, Aaron and Luke. I hadn't seen them in years, and the trip was pitched as part reunion, part therapy retreat. We crammed into 2 cars, Marcus leading, me riding shotgun with Holly while Aaron and Luke followed behind. The farther we drove, the less the road looked like a road. Gravel gave way to dirt, dirt to stone, until it was little more than a scar through trees that seemed to grow closer every mile. Branches brushed the roof and windows like bony fingers. At one point, Holly muttered, "Nobody should be living out here," and pressed her forehead to the glass. When we finally reached the cabin, it looked even worse than the pictures. The place sagged under its own weight, as if it had been left to rot but stubbornly refused to collapse. Logs had blackened with age and damp. The roof dipped in the middle, and the porch leaned so much I was surprised it still held up. There was a swing hanging from rusted chains, but it didn't move, not even with the breeze. Inside, the air smelled metallic and sour, like wet pennies and old mildew. The furniture didn't match, heavy handmade chairs beside cheap particle board shelves. The upstairs rooms were cramped with slanted ceilings, dust thick in the corners. No cell signal, no Wi-Fi, just a battered radio that spat nothing but static no matter how much Marcus fiddled with the dial. Still, that first night was fine. Aaron broke out some edibles. Marcus stocked enough beer to drown an army. And we sat around the fire pit telling stories under a sky littered with stars. Holly kept stealing glances at the tree line, and Aaron, already buzzed, decided to bring up local Appalachian folklore. "Don't whistle at night out here," he warned with a grin, then immediately whistled. Luke rolled his eyes and countered with an online story about hikers who vanish in the gorge with no trace. He claimed some people believe the forest itself chooses who stays. We all laughed, but Holly didn't. She hugged her knees and said nothing, eyes darting back to the black shapes of trees. I went to bed around 2. My room was upstairs, window facing the rear woods. I was used to city noise back in Charleston, sirens, cars, my neighbor's TV seeping through thin walls. Out here the silence felt unnatural, like holding your breath underwater. Sometime around 4 I woke with my pulse hammering. The sound was small but clear, a single step on the stairs. Heavy, deliberate, like someone putting all their weight into it. I held my breath, straining for another. Nothing. Just the silence settling back in. I nearly woke Marcus but stopped myself. He'd just tell me I was jumpy. The next morning, Holly swore her phone had vanished. She'd left it charging on the coffee table, cord still plugged in but no phone attached. We all tore the place apart. Nothing. Later I realized one of my socks was gone, just one, from a pair I'd set on the chair. I laughed it off, but when Aaron discovered his watch missing, a watch he claimed never to take off, not even Holly joked. That afternoon we tried hiking. There were no trails, no markers, just woods in every direction, but Marcus insisted a little wandering wouldn't hurt. An hour in, we found something odd, a rusted pickup half sunken into the dirt, vines choking the hood, windows shattered from the inside. No road led to it. No tire tracks, no path. Just the truck, abandoned where no truck should be. We stood around staring until Luke muttered, "We should head back before dark." No one argued. The return hike stretched longer than it should have. The trees looked closer, the air colder. Holly rubbed her arms though it was July. We reached the cabin as the last light died. That night the sound came again. Not footsteps this time. Scraping. Long, dragging pulls across the floorboards under my bed. I froze, every muscle locked, too terrified to look. It went on and on, like something testing the wood. When it stopped, I leaned over with the flashlight, heart stuttering. Dust, nothing else. But I know what I heard. By morning, one of us was gone. Luke. His boots missing, his jacket still draped on a chair, bed untouched. We searched the woods, shouted his name until our voices cracked. Marcus found tracks behind the cabin, boot prints pressed deep into the soil. They trailed into the forest before simply stopping. No fade, no shift in dirt. Just gone, like he'd been plucked up out of the world. Panic bled into arguments. Holly wanted to leave immediately. Marcus said we'd wait till daylight. Aaron insisted we'd get lost without the road. No one trusted anyone else, but we agreed to stick together. That night we barricaded the doors with furniture, stacked chairs and shelves against the windows. At 3 a.m., the lights went out. No hum of the fridge, no static from the radio. The silence was total. I peeked from behind the curtain. There was someone by Marcus's SUV. At first I thought it was Luke. Barefoot, shirtless, pale skin glowing in moonlight. His arms dangled too low, his head tilted at a crooked angle like his neck had been twisted. Then he lifted a hand and waved. Not a casual wave, a slow, uneven gesture, like a child imitating something they'd seen but didn't understand. I dropped to the floor, shaking so hard my teeth chattered. When morning came, the road we'd driven in on was gone. Nothing but trees where gravel should have been, as though the forest had swallowed it whole. Aaron lost it, said he wasn't waiting around to die. He grabbed his pack and bolted into the woods. We chased, shouting his name, but he moved faster than we could. After an hour, all we found was part of his hoodie, shredded and hanging from a branch. Back at the cabin, everything inside was gone. Bags, food, keys, even the chairs we'd used for barricades. The place was stripped bare except for one thing, Luke's phone on the counter. Battery dead, but one video file still playable. The footage shook with his breath. He was crouched behind a tree, whispering, eyes wide. "They're not people. Don't go into the woods. They copy you. They take your face. They take everything." The video cut into static. That night shapes gathered at the windows. They didn't knock. They didn't try to get in. They only stared, mouths slack, movements jerky. Holly whispered Marcus's name, but I don't think she recognized him. Not really. The thing outside had Marcus's face, but the smile stretched too slow, the eyes didn't blink. It was like watching someone rehearse humanity. We didn't sleep. We didn't move. When the sun rose, the figures were gone. No footprints. No proof. Just emptiness. We walked until our legs gave out, picked a direction and prayed. Hours later, we stumbled onto a road where a trucker finally pulled over. He said we were near a place called Alder Hollow. When Marcus mentioned Briar Run Lodge, the man frowned. "There's nothing built out that way," he said. "Ain't been for years. Just woods." He gave us a lift into town. We didn't talk much on the ride. That was 2 years ago. I don't know what happened to Marcus or Holly after. We scattered, stopped returning each other's calls. Sometimes I dream about the cabin, about faces at the glass trying to smile right. Sometimes I wake up certain I hear slow, dragging footsteps on the stairs of my apartment. And once, just last week, I found one of my socks missing. Only one. The other lay neatly folded on the chair. I didn't laugh this time. My life had become a routine of bleach fumes, empty hallways, and trying not to think too hard about how I'd ended up there. Grant was always behind, my car barely ran, and most nights I'd come home too wired to sleep, but too exhausted to do anything else. So when my co-worker Jeremiah told me his aunt's neighbor was looking for help at his property, up near the Clinch Mountain Range, I didn't hesitate. The pay was cash, the job vague, and that was enough. Jeremiah warned me the guy wasn't sociable, but all I cared about was keeping the lights on another month. The instructions were simple. Meet him at an abandoned general store an hour outside Tazewell. No GPS, no address, just a crossroad marked by a caved-in roof and a pump rusted down to its bones. I stuffed a duffel with work gloves, boots, a flashlight, and enough canned food to scrape by. My plan was to fix some porch beams, patch a roof, and be gone before I thought too much about the strangeness of it. The man arrived late in an old Dodge truck that looked chewed apart by decades of gravel roads. The bed rattled with chains, and in the passenger seat sat a shepherd mutt with ears sharp as knives. The man, he only introduced himself as Calder, barely nodded before telling me to follow. We drove deeper and deeper into switchbacks and hollows. At first it was patched pavement, then gravel, then pure rock paths where my Civic bottomed out twice. Every curve looked the same, trees pressed in, leaning overhead until the sky felt choked out. I lost track of time. My phone went dead 2 ridges back, and it was just the roar of engines and the woods closing in. At last, we pulled into a clearing. The cabin stood there like it had been dropped and forgotten. The roof slouched beneath a blue tarp half shredded by storms. One of the porch beams was braced by a stump. The logs had darkened to near black. Nothing about it said home. It was a place that tolerated people rather than welcomed them. Inside, the air smelled of damp ash and something sharp, like fur left wet too long. The first room held a crooked wood stove, and against one wall, a hulking radio the size of a coffin, with knobs fat as fists and a coiled antenna shoved out the window. Calder caught me looking. "Don't touch it," he said flatly. That was the only time he mentioned the radio. He showed me to a side room, bare mattress on a sagging frame, one nail jutting out of the wall where a jacket could hang. No lock on the door, just a bent hook latch. Before leaving, he added, "If you need anything, ask once. Not twice." Then he shut the door. That first night, I lay awake listening to the forest. Or rather, the lack of it. No crickets, no cicadas, not even the occasional breeze. It felt like the woods were swallowing their own sounds. We worked the next day on the porch. Calder was efficient, strong despite his age, but every so often he'd stop mid-swing, grip the hammer tighter, and stare past the tree line. Not casually, like he was trying to fix his eyes on something slipping between the trunks. The first time I ignored it. The second time I asked, "Do you see deer or something?" He didn't look at me. Not deer. Nothing worth naming. That answer knotted in my chest. On the third night, I woke to a noise. Scratching. Rhythmic, steady, coming from behind the wall where my bed pressed up. Not frantic like a mouse, deliberate. Claw on wood, circling, then stopping altogether. I lay frozen, counting breaths, until the silence returned like a blanket dropped over the world. At dawn I found Calder on the porch with his dog. Only now there was one. "You're missing a dog," I said. He shook his head. "No, it's not like that." He didn't explain. That night I dragged the dresser in front of my door. Slept dressed, boots on. Around midnight came the thump of footsteps on the deck. Slow, heavy, each one measured. Then the sound of something being pulled across the boards, right against the wall where my head lay. A long scrape. A pause. Then 3 knocks, evenly spaced. I clenched the knife I'd tucked under my pillow and didn't move until the first gray light of dawn. Calder noticed my face when I emerged. He handed me a stick of chalk, white as bone. "Mark your door before you sleep," he said. "One line. If it changes, wake me." I asked, "Changes how?" He didn't answer. The 5th night I understood. Around 2 in the morning, something slammed onto the porch. Not a stomp, not a fall, more like a body dropped from above. Dragging followed, wet and deliberate. The dog barked once, sharp, then choked into silence. The woods hushed. Even the wind died. Inside, bare feet slapped the boards, unhurried, approaching my door. Then whispers seeped through the cracks in the logs. Not English. Not words. Sounds shaped into the rhythm of speech, like a throat forcing air where no language lived. It shifted, staggered, then slid closer to something I recognized. My name. Almost. Wrong by a syllable. At sunrise, Calder was gone. His shotgun missing, his boots absent from the porch. The radio hissed low static inside, though I hadn't seen him switch it on. The final night, I barricaded my door again, chalk marked clear as bone white. Midnight came. 1 a.m. came. Then at 2:11, the generator sputtered and died. The cabin exhaled into silence. The knob turned. Slow, deliberate. The chalk line I'd drawn scraped itself away before my eyes. Feet padded inside, wet against the boards. My breath locked. A whisper pressed against the crack of the doorframe, softer than before, but perfect this time. My own name, in my own voice. The last thing I remember was collapsing backward. When I opened my eyes, it was morning. Door wide. Floor damp. Chalk gone. My pillow stank of soil, like it had been buried and dug up. Calder never returned. I stuffed my bag, didn't look back, and walked until my phone found a signal. Jeremiah picked me up at the store. I didn't tell him much, only that his aunt's neighbor wouldn't be needing me again. But here's the thing. Since then, I still hear it. Not in the woods, not at night. In my apartment. From the vents, from the pipes. Sometimes from under the floor when the building settles. Always around 2:11 a.m. And last week, it stopped trying to say my name wrong. Now it says it right. My name is Lena. I was 32 the summer I rented that cabin, and I thought I was doing it for all the right reasons. I just finished my 5th year as a public defender in Richmond, and the weight of losing case after case had left me hollow. My clients rarely walked free. The city noise followed me into my dreams, and the guilt came home with me no matter how many times I told myself I'd done all I could. My therapist suggested a retreat, a reset. Find somewhere quiet, somewhere with no signal. So when I found the listing for a mountain cabin retreat tucked deep in the Cumberland Gap region of eastern Tennessee, I booked it without thinking twice. The website looked half dead, its fonts outdated, photos pixelated. The cabin was called Maple Hollow Rest, though the pictures showed no maples, only pines and a clearing where the grass looked brittle. The reviews were odd. One simply read very still. Another said good if you don't mind the nights. I didn't care. All I wanted was silence. The owner, a man named Harlan, met me at a gas station with peeling green pumps and a hand-painted sign that read bait, beer, bullets. He was wiry, eyes sunken, his handshake cold. He didn't waste words. Just handed me a brass key and said, "Road's rough. When the pavement ends, keep straight till you see a cedar with a chain nailed around it. That's the turn." The drive was worse than I expected. Dirt roads that twisted into hollows so narrow I thought I'd scrape the car doors off. The trees leaned together overhead like ribs knitting a cage. After 40 minutes of switchbacks and gravel, the cabin appeared in a dip of land, squatting at the edge of a clearing. 2 stories, but hunched, with logs blackened by weather and a roof sagging under a patched tarp. A crooked porch wrapped halfway around, one railing missing. Inside, the air was stale with mildew and wood smoke. There was no television, no phone line, no signal. Just a wood stove, a clawfoot tub stained iron red at the bottom, and a generator out back that coughed to life only after 3 yanks on the cord. The upstairs room I chose had one window facing the forest, but the glass was so old it warped the view, turning the trees into melted shapes. At first, that distortion felt comforting, like the woods couldn't really see me. The first 2 days were fine. I read until the pages blurred, hiked the ridge until my legs burned, and sat on the porch with instant coffee, listening to the nothing. For the first time in years, no phones buzzed, no voices pulled at me, no sirens. By the second evening, I realized I hadn't looked at my phone once. It was exactly what I wanted. The third night, everything shifted. At 2:15 a.m., I woke with my chest tight, like the air itself had thickened. The generator had cut out. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was a heavy, smothering absence. I sat up, heart pounding, and heard it, a sound low and strange, halfway between a cough and a bark. Then, 3 slow taps against wood. Not frantic, deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the front window. Nothing, just the warped blur of trees. I held my breath and listened. A rustle, then the hush of leaves, then silence again. I barred the door with the iron poker and sat awake until dawn painted the warped glass gray. The next morning I called Harlan, once I found a ridge with a flicker of service. I told him the generator had failed. I didn't mention the cough or the knocks. He arrived at dusk with a toolbox, pulled the cord once, and the generator roared awake like it had never failed. He wiped his hands and glanced at me. Sometimes these old ones flood. Then, too casually, he added, "Hear anything else?" My gut tightened. I lied and said no. He nodded and muttered, "Coyotes, maybe." That night I couldn't relax. I laid out the flashlight, the poker, even a can of pepper spray. The silence stretched like a held breath. At 3:04 a.m., the generator sputtered out again. A pause, then slow steps across the porch. The wood groaned with weight. 3 knocks. Then a voice. Flat. Calm. Let me in. I'm cold. Not pleading. Not angry. Just stating, as though it had every right. I pressed my back against the wall and prayed my heartbeat wasn't loud enough to give me away. The voice didn't repeat. The steps retreated. When dawn came, the dirt outside showed no prints. I wanted to leave, but something held me. Pride, maybe. Or that lawyer's stubbornness I could never shake. I told myself I'd last the week. The next evening, Harlan returned without me asking. This time he brought a burlap sack. Inside was coarse salt, twine, and a brass bell tarnished green. Line the doors, he told me. Hang the bell. If it rings, don't answer. Don't look. I asked who. He stared past me into the trees. They don't keep names. I wanted to push, but the way his voice cracked silenced me. We poured salt across thresholds and nailed the bell above the porch beam. It swayed gently, silent in the still air. That night I slept in my clothes, every light on. At 2:49 a.m., the generator quit. The hush fell like a lid slamming shut. The bell rang once, then again louder, then silence. Steps crossed the porch, slow, steady. I clutched the poker until my hand ached. The voice returned. You left the back open. I hadn't. I knew I hadn't. 2 thuds struck the rear wall, hard enough to rattle dust from the beams. My flashlight flared for half a second before the bulb burst in my hand, searing my palm. Sparks fizzled, then died. I sat in the dark, too terrified to breathe. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. When dawn finally seeped through the warped glass, the bell hung silent, the salt lines unbroken, the dirt outside smooth as untouched clay. No footprints, no marks, nothing but me. I packed by fading daylight, my hands shaking so badly I dropped my keys twice. I drove until the trees thinned and the road found pavement again. At the highway sign, I finally breathed. Weeks later, when I tried to look up Maple Hollow Rest, the listing was gone. No trace of the page, no record of the owner. I called the number on my receipt, but it rang dead. I should have left it there. But 2 nights ago, in my Richmond apartment, the power flickered off at 2:49 a.m. My phone died, even though it had been charging. The silence that filled the room was the same, too complete, pressing in. Then, from the hallway, 3 knocks, and a voice. Flat, calm, my own voice this time. Let me in. I wasn't looking for adventure when this all happened. I was 34, working as a middle school history teacher in Knoxville. The kind of job that grinds you down slowly until you barely notice how much of yourself you've given up to classroom noise, grading stacks, and cafeteria duty. I'd been on summer break for only 2 weeks when my older brother Matthew called with one of his schemes. He'd rented some backwoods cabin in the Unaka Range near the Tennessee, North Carolina line. Told me it would be a detox from civilization. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, just hiking trails, firewood, and enough time to breathe without hearing bells or announcements. He pitched it like a brotherly reset, and because I didn't want to admit how lonely I'd been feeling, I agreed. Matt picked me up on a sweltering Sunday morning, his pickup loaded with coolers, tackle boxes, and a grocery sack full of jerky, canned chili, and off-brand beer. He'd shaved his head into a messy buzz cut that week, probably because of the heat, and wore that restless grin of his that always meant he hadn't planned a single detail beyond the drive. I should have known better, but I climbed in anyway, telling myself maybe he was right. Maybe I needed the woods. The first few hours were normal enough. Interstates and state highways rolled by with the usual mix of billboards, gas stations, and fast food chains. But once we crossed into the folds of the Unakas, the scenery thickened into endless trees, and the road shrank into curling switchbacks that made my stomach churn. Our GPS lost its signal miles before the turnoff, so Matt guided us with a scribbled note some rental owner had emailed him. The gravel road we finally turned onto didn't look like it had seen a county truck in years. Trees pressed close on either side, their crowns knitting together to blot out chunks of sky, and the truck rattled so hard over potholes I thought the axles would snap. The cabin, when it appeared, didn't look like any rental I'd ever seen. It was a squat single-story structure perched on a slope that seemed too steep to hold it. Its siding had gone gray, its roof patched with tar paper, one shutter dangling crooked as though a storm had tried to rip it free. No welcome mat, no fresh tire tracks, no sign of upkeep. The air smelled like wet leaves and iron, and for a moment I thought maybe we'd taken a wrong turn. But Matt slammed the truck door and stretched like we'd arrived at a resort. "Home sweet home," he crowed, lugging a cooler toward the porch that tilted at a worrying angle. I stayed back, staring at the way the forest pressed in around the place, as if the trees had been waiting for us. Inside wasn't much better. The whole place was one dimly lit room with a sagging sofa, a kitchenette whose counters you could touch both at once, and a hallway that led to two small bedrooms. A wall clock ticked so loudly I could feel it in my teeth. The air carried the faint scent of mildew and something sharper underneath, like charred wood. The only light came from a buzzing lamp in the corner that seemed on the verge of dying. I forced a smile when Matt handed me a beer, but the back of my neck prickled. The silence in that cabin wasn't the peace people talk about when they praise the mountains. It was the kind of silence that made you wonder what had been listening before you arrived. That first night was ordinary enough. We grilled burgers on the rusted fire pit outside, drank too much, told stories about high school football and disastrous dates. Nothing moved in the trees, no animals rustled. The stars were sharp and bright. I fell asleep telling myself I'd overreacted. The second night unraveled all that. Around 2 in the morning, I woke with a dry throat and padded outside barefoot, not wanting to bother with the bathroom, whose pipes made a faint moaning sound whenever water ran. The porch boards groaned under my weight. I stood there under thin moonlight when I heard it, a slow crunch of leaves, deliberate, maybe 20 feet into the tree-line. Then another. Not a deer. I'd grown up hunting with my father, and deer blundered. They didn't pace themselves like that. My chest went tight. I whispered my brother's name, even though I knew he was inside, and the sound that came back wasn't a voice. It was breathing, close enough that I felt it under my skin. I fumbled the door latch, slipped back inside, and locked it without daring to look out a window. My pulse didn't settle until dawn. I didn't tell Matt the next morning. He would have just laughed, accused me of spooking myself. Instead, I stayed up late the following night, shuffling through a deck of cards I found in a drawer, pretending solitaire would steady my nerves. Near midnight, the sound came again. This time not in the woods, but right on the gravel outside, measured footsteps, and then 2 deliberate knocks at the front door. Gentle, almost polite. I sat frozen in the kitchen chair, breath held. 10 minutes passed. I checked Matt. He was snoring loud enough to rattle his door. Then another knock came, slower, heavier, as though whoever it was wanted to feel the wood under their hand. I turned on every light in the cabin, checked every lock, and sat until morning without closing my eyes. We drove into the nearest town the following afternoon. A ghostly little place with a single gas station, a diner, and several boarded-up shops. I asked the man at the counter if there were bears in the area, or kids who played pranks on hikers. He stared at me too long, his eyes going distant, and finally muttered, "Folks don't go up that road anymore." When I pressed, he just shook his head and said, "You'll hear things," before ringing up our snacks like the conversation had never happened. I didn't bring it up to Matt again. That night, Matt shook me awake just after 1. His face was pale, his eyes wide. "Someone's out back," he whispered. We crouched by the kitchen window, peering into the dark. There, between the trees, stood a figure. Tall, unmoving. Its arms hung at odd lengths, longer than they should have been, and its head tilted as if listening for a sound. My skin went cold. We didn't move. The figure didn't walk forward. It seemed to twitch closer, like the world had skipped a frame. We shoved the dresser against the front door and sat clutching the biggest knife we could find, listening as it circled the cabin. Sometimes slow, sometimes fast, sometimes with a dragging step that made me think of something injured. At one point I swore there were 2 sets of footsteps. Then, before dawn, silence. When we opened the door the next morning, for deep gouges marred the wood. Not scratches like from an animal, but carved as though by claws or knives. Matt didn't joke this time. He just muttered, "We're leaving," and I didn't argue. We piled into the truck, leaving half our stuff behind. But 5 minutes down the gravel track, the road was gone. Not blocked, not washed out, gone. Where there should have been gravel, there was only forest, dense and unbroken. We turned back. Same thing. Tried side paths that hadn't been there before, circled until the gas gauge dropped dangerously low. Every direction ended in trees. That's when we saw it again. Standing in the middle of the trail, that same figure, motionless, faceless, head cocked and listening. Matt cursed, threw the truck in reverse, and we tore backward until a path appeared that neither of us remembered. Branches whipped the windshield, rocks battered the undercarriage. Then, without warning, pavement appeared under the tires, smooth and perfect, and the forest fell away as though it had never closed around us. Civilization returned in a jarring blink. We didn't talk much on the ride back. Once home, Matt tried to pull up the rental listing. Nothing. No record. No trace of an owner, no cabin on any site. He even called the company he swore he'd booked through. They denied ever hosting a property there. We both agreed, silently, to drop it. For months, I almost convinced myself it had been some shared hallucination, a mix of exhaustion and alcohol and paranoia. Until last week, when I opened my mailbox, an envelope lay inside. No stamp, no return address. Just my name written in a slant I didn't recognize. Inside was a strip of thick, yellowed paper that felt more like bark than parchment. Etched into it, with lines deep enough to cut skin, was the same branching symbol we'd seen gouged into the cabin's door. Not letters, not art, more like roots spreading, veins reaching, or cracks crawling across stone. I've kept it in a drawer since then, though I know I should burn it. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear the steady tick of that cabin's clock, even though my apartment doesn't have one. And I keep wondering how far the forest might really be from here, waiting for me to step outside again. I was 29 the summer I agreed to help an old professor of mine with what he called a property check. Dr. Caldwell had taught folklore at East Tennessee State, one of those eccentric academics who wore BOLO ties and carried leather notebooks like it was still 1975. He knew I was strapped for cash, graduate school loans piling up while I scraped by on substitute teaching gigs and tutoring, and he offered me $350 if I'd spend a weekend at his late uncle's cabin on the slopes of Buffalo Mountain. 2 nights, that's all, he'd said. The place hasn't been opened in years. Just make sure the roof isn't collapsing, the generator still works, and that raccoons haven't claimed it. It sounded simple enough, and the money was more than I'd make in a week tutoring. I told myself it would be a quiet retreat, maybe even a chance to draft some articles I'd been meaning to send off to academic journals. I packed a laptop, a stack of books, canned food, and a sleeping bag, figuring I'd treat it like a writing residency in the woods. The drive out wound longer than I expected. Once I left Johnson City behind, cell service dropped to nothing. The highway shrank to a pitted two-lane, and then the turnoff became a gravel path with a gate that hadn't been shut in years. A rusted chain still dangled from one post, but the lock was missing. The road clawed up the ridge in switchbacks so tight I thought my old Toyota Corolla might roll backward. The air grew cooler, heavier with pine. It was the kind of stretch of forest where every bend looked the same, every tree a twin of the last. When the clearing finally appeared, I thought the cabin would look quaint, like something out of a postcard. It wasn't. It squatted at the edge of a slope, green paint faded to the color of swamp water, its porch sagging as though it had been carrying the mountain's weight for too long. 2 rocking chairs sat like sentries, one tilting sideways with a broken leg, the other crusted in bird droppings. The windows were small and black, like they'd been boarded up from the inside. Inside wasn't much better. A cot with a rolled sleeping bag, a table scarred by old knife marks, a fireplace stuffed with soot, a propane stove that stank faintly of gas. Against one wall, a rack of hunting rifles gathered dust. I didn't touch them. A clock ticked loudly above the door, the sound exaggerated in the silence. I remember standing there, groceries still in my arms, and realizing how alone I felt. Not peaceful alone, abandoned alone. The first night wasn't terrible. I cooked a can of soup on the stove, sat on the porch with a flashlight, and listened to the wind. It wasn't quiet, exactly. The trees creaked like old bones, insects trilled. But it wasn't the kind of noise that made sense either. The longer I sat, the more it felt like the forest itself was shifting its weight, waiting. I told myself I was being silly. Sometime after midnight, I woke suddenly. No sound had stirred me. I just snapped awake, my heart hammering as though I'd run a mile. Then came the knock. Not on the door, on the wall. A single, hollow thud, like a fist pressed against wood. 5 minutes later, another knock, this time from the opposite side of the cabin. I held still on the cot, gripping my flashlight, the beam trembling across the ceiling. I told myself it was an animal brushing against the siding. That worked until the generator died with a metallic click outside. I forced myself to the door, unbolted it, and stepped onto the porch barefoot, flashlight shaking in my hand. The generator sat 20 feet back on its cinder blocks. The switch wasn't tripped. It had been flipped down, neat as anything. My throat went dry. Someone had walked right up to it. I spun the light across the trees, across the grass, but nothing moved. No footprints in the soft dirt, no bent branches. Just the sense of something hiding where the beam couldn't reach. I switched the generator back on and slammed inside, bolting the door until the metal groaned. I didn't sleep again. The next day, I tried to distract myself with chores. Cleared the pine needles from the roof, checked the rain barrels. They were half full and slimy, and circled the clearing. That's when I saw the tree. About 10 feet into the woods, its bark bore 4 deep gouges, running vertical like claw marks. They were too uneven to be from an axe, too high for a bear unless it was standing upright. I snapped a photo out of instinct, even though my phone had no service. By afternoon, I was pacing the porch with one of the rifles propped beside me. Unloaded, but it made me feel less useless. The forest seemed unnaturally still. No birds, no insects, not even wind. When the sun went down, the air pressed heavy, like the woods were holding their breath. The knocking returned after 1 in the morning. This time it circled. Tap, tap, tap. Slow, deliberate, knuckles dragging across the siding as though someone were walking around the cabin, pausing at each wall. I sat with my back to the cot, rifle across my lap, flashlight beside me, lungs burning from how shallow I was breathing. Then came a scraping sound under the door. Something small slid into the cabin, bumping against my foot. I flicked the flashlight down. It was a stone, perfectly round, polished like river glass. Too smooth to have come from the mountain. I kicked it back outside, shoved my jacket into the crack beneath the door, and sat frozen. A moment later, breathing began, right against the door. Slow, steady, human breathing through the keyhole. I nearly vomited from the terror of it. At first light, I packed. I left the generator humming, food still on the shelf, rifles on the wall. I shoved everything I owned into the Corolla and gunned it down the gravel road, not even glancing back at the cabin. Halfway down the ridge, I slowed at a bend. A tree on the roadside had something nailed to it. At first I thought it was a sign. Then my stomach dropped. It was a photograph. A photo of me, taken from the woods, sitting on the porch with my headlamp the first night. Trail mix in my lap. My face lit like I'd been posed. I didn't stop. Didn't touch it. I drove until I saw pavement, until my phone lit with service, and I called Dr. Caldwell with shaking hands. "I'm done," I told him. "Don't send anyone else up there." He started to ask questions, but I hung up. For days, I tried to rationalize it. Some local messing with me. Some hunter playing a cruel trick. Until last night, when I found something on my kitchen table. I live in a locked apartment in town, 3rd floor, door with 2 deadbolts. And yet, when I came home from the grocery store, a stone sat there. The same smooth, round kind that had been pushed under the cabin door. Taped beneath it was a note written in faded ink. They still walk the walls of the mountain. You listen too long. I haven't slept since. I was 31 the summer my former roommate, Blake, reached out of nowhere. We hadn't spoken since college. He'd been the guy who showed up late to class in hiking boots, smelling like campfire, ranting about how professors didn't understand the real world. I'd stayed on the straight track, grad school, a job in town, evenings spent grading essays, but he'd vanished into seasonal work and odd jobs. So when his name lit up my inbox, I almost ignored it. The subject line read, "Need a hand at the old place. Good money." The message was short. He said he'd inherited a cabin from an uncle in the Allegheny Highlands, near the West Virginia line. The roof needed patching, the floorboards shored up, the kind of work he couldn't do alone. He promised me a decent payout and a few days of quiet, a little mountain detox. I'd just finished a brutal semester of teaching high school English. My nerves were shot from wrangling freshmen who thought TikTok was literature. So the idea of disappearing into the woods for a long weekend sounded less like a chore and more like a reprieve. He picked me up in an old Jeep Wagoneer that coughed black smoke, and he turned the key. The back was crammed with toolboxes, tarps, and a dented cooler. Blake hadn't changed much. Wiry beard, flannel shirt despite the July heat. The kind of manic enthusiasm that made you forgive how reckless he could be. "Wait till you see the ridge," he kept saying, his hands drumming the wheel as though the mountain itself was calling him back. The first hours were fine, interstate, then Tulane Highway, gas station coffee. But when we turned off onto a road marked only by a bullet-riddled sign, my stomach tightened. The pavement gave way to dirt, then rock, then what barely counted as a trail. Trees closed in so tight that branches scraped the windows like fingernails. My phone lost signal. The GPS went blank. It was as though we'd slipped off the map. When the Jeep finally lurched into a clearing, I saw the cabin. It wasn't picturesque. The siding was dark with rot, the roofline sagged, and the porch leaned as though it were exhaling its last breath. A chimney jutted sideways like a broken tooth. I remember thinking this wasn't a vacation rental. It was a mausoleum that had forgotten to collapse. But Blake hopped out like it was paradise, clapping me on the shoulder. "Doesn't look like much, but she's still standing." Inside, the place smelled of wet wood and rust. The living room had warped floorboards and peeling wallpaper. Its pattern faded into something that looked more like stains than design. Family portraits still hung crooked on the walls, but all the faces looked stiff and unsmiling, as though they'd been photographed during a funeral. A cot sat in the corner, still covered with a moth-eaten quilt. In the back, a cellar door sagged open, leading into shadows. We spent the first afternoon clearing debris and nailing boards over the worst of the window gaps. For a few hours, it felt almost normal, two guys tackling a fixer-upper, trading stories, sharing beers. But while sweeping the rear bedroom, I found something that didn't fit. Along the baseboard, carved into the wood, were long gouges. 5 of them, perfectly vertical, chest-high. Too deliberate to be scratches, too ragged to be done with a blade. I called Blake over. He glanced, hesitated, then said, "Yeah, my uncle told me about those. Don't worry about it." He walked out before I could press further. That night, we sat on the porch eating burnt hot dogs, lantern light casting orange circles around us. Blake told stories about his uncle, quiet man, lived up here alone for decades, rarely came down into town. He said the ridge listens, Blake muttered after his third beer, staring at the treeline. I laughed it off, but he didn't smile. I tried to sleep on the cot, but the air pressed too heavy, and the silence wasn't silence at all. It was layered, like holding a seashell to your ear and hearing distant currents. Around 2 a.m., something shifted outside. Not an animal scurrying, not the wind. A measured step, then another, crunching over leaves just beyond the porch. I froze, holding my breath, and then the cellar door creaked. Slow, long, as if weight was pressing against it from below. I shook Blake awake. He sat up, eyes wide before I even explained. He grabbed a crowbar, I took the flashlight, and we crept to the cellar entrance. The beam lit the first few steps, dust floating in the air. Nothing moved, but the smell rose, earthy, damp, tinged with rot. We shut it, bolted it, and stayed in the living room until dawn. The next day, while hauling boards outside, I noticed a tree near the cabin with bark stripped away in narrow spirals. At first I thought it was lightning damage, until I realized the pattern wasn't random. It formed a shape, circular, with lines radiating outward like veins or roots. I snapped a photo, but Blake snatched the phone out of my hand. "Don't keep that," he said flatly, deleting it before handing it back. His face was pale. By evening, we were both on edge. We played cards by lantern light, pretending not to hear the sounds outside. Soft knocks on the siding, faint tapping against the glass. When the voices began, neither of us moved. They came from the trees. Low, urgent murmurs, too far to make out words, but close enough to feel aimed at us. I finally stepped onto the porch, flashlight sweeping. Nothing, yet the whispers carried, circling us, always just beyond reach. Then something called Blake's name. Clear, sharp, male. My chest seized. Blake stiffened, crowbar trembling in his grip. Then it tried again, slower, like it was learning. Cake. I yanked him inside, bolted the door, shoved furniture against it. That night was worse. Knocks at every wall. Footsteps pacing the porch. Scratches dragging along the windowsill. Once, a voice whispered through the keyhole, and it wasn't calling his name. It was my father's voice, though my father had been dead 5 years. "Come out, son," it said. My skin went ice cold. I didn't tell Blake. At dawn, we thought maybe we'd imagined it, until I saw something lying on the porch boards. A bundle of bones, small animal maybe, tied with twine into a crooked shape. A charm or a warning. Blake picked it up with shaking hands. "He was making these," he whispered. "My uncle. He said they kept it out." His voice cracked. "But they don't last." The second night we didn't bother pretending to sleep. We kept lanterns lit, knives ready. The thing or things never showed themselves fully. Sometimes I caught a glimpse between the trees. Too tall, limbs jointed wrong, a head cocked at an angle as if listening. Other times laughter bubbled outside, jagged, broken, like someone who had heard laughter once but didn't know how to do it right. When morning came, Blake refused to leave. "It won't follow us if we stay," he said, his eyes bloodshot, words frantic. "It's the land. If we leave, it follows." I argued until my throat hurt. He didn't budge. Around noon, while prying up a loose floorboard, I found another bundle of bones wedged beneath it. Dozens, tied tight with string, arranged into a pattern. The same spiral I'd seen on the tree. My stomach flipped. His uncle hadn't just made charms. He'd been trying to contain something. That was enough for me. I grabbed my pack, told Blake he could rot here if he wanted, and walked out. He didn't follow. The path down felt longer, twisted. My legs burned. I walked 3 miles until I reached a gas station on the state highway. Its parking lot cracked and empty. The attendant looked up as I stumbled in. "You come off the ridge?" he asked. When I nodded, his face tightened. "Folks don't keep cabins there. Not anymore. That was a year ago. I haven't seen Blake since. He still sends me messages sometimes, short ones, that listens. Don't answer the door." I made more charms. Last week, I came home from work to find something on my apartment floor. A bundle of bones tied with twine, arranged in the same spiral. I live 3 states away now. My locks weren't broken. My windows were shut. And when I lifted it, I swear I heard my father's voice muffled, as though spoken through wood. "You shouldn't have left him." I was 27 the winter my girlfriend, Alana, convinced me to get away from everything. She worked double shifts at a hospital in Charleston. I was grinding through an architecture internship that mostly meant making coffee and updating spreadsheets. We'd barely seen each other in months, and when she suggested escaping into the mountains during her short break, I jumped at it. No deadlines, no phone calls, just a weekend away where no one could reach us. Her uncle Martin offered us his hunting cabin up in the Monongahela National Forest, near the edge of the Cheat Mountain Range. He warned us it hadn't been used in years, that it was drafty, that the pipes might be frozen. "You'll need firewood," he said over the phone, "and don't linger outside after dark." He said it so matter-of-fact that it didn't even register until later. The drive was long, winding through valleys where the snow piled up in drifts taller than our car. Once we turned onto the forest road, it felt like we'd left the world behind. The tires slipped on packed ice. Trees crowded the trail, and the sky above was a gray bruise. By the time we pulled into the clearing, night was swallowing the ridge. The cabin looked sturdier than I expected. 2 stories of weather-darkened wood, tin roof bowed with snow, porch stacked with old logs. A small chimney smoked faintly as though daring us to believe it still worked. There were no other houses in sight, no glow of distant windows, just black forest pressing in on all sides. Inside was colder than outside. My breath fogged in the air until Alana coaxed the fireplace to life. Slowly, the rooms shed their icebox feel and revealed themselves. A plaid couch sagged in the living room, a chair leaned permanently left. The kitchen had a yellowed refrigerator that buzzed like an angry hornet and a gas stove coated with grease. Down the hall was a single bedroom with a heavy wooden bed frame and an exposed beam running lengthwise above it. That beam bothered me right away. It was too wide, boxed in with seams that didn't match the rest of the ceiling. Whoever built it hadn't meant it as decoration or support. It looked like something had been hidden. We ate soup from cans, played cards, tried to convince ourselves the stillness was restful. Around midnight, Alana muted the old movie playing on her laptop. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. At first I didn't. Then it came, a faint scraping, soft but steady, as though someone were tracing circles with a nail. It moved across the floor beneath us, dragging from one end of the cabin to the other. Then it stopped directly under the bedroom. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped out onto the porch, breath steaming in the frozen air. I crouched by the crawl space, shining light between the slats. Nothing. No animal, no shifting shadows. I told myself it must have been a raccoon. But when I climbed back into bed, I couldn't shake the thought of something stretched flat beneath the floorboards, waiting. Sometime in the night, I woke to the sound of breathing. It wasn't Alana's. It was slower, ragged, wet. It came from the corner closet. My phone's flashlight beam trembled as I scanned the cracked door. It was open an inch, and for reasons I can't explain, that gap terrified me more than if it had been wide open. I slammed it shut, heart pounding. When I turned back toward the bed, I glanced up. The boxed-in beam above us had seams, nails, slight gaps, like it wasn't part of the original frame at all. The next morning I pointed it out. Alana knocked on the wood. Hollow. She shrugged. Probably storage. But there was no latch, no hinge. Then why seal it? I asked. She didn't answer. We spent the day trying to hike behind the ridge, crunching through brittle branches, ears ringing in the oppressive silence. When we came back, the front door was unlocked. I know I'd locked it. The metal was still cold, unbroken. Inside, nothing was missing, except the pillows. They were lined neatly on the floor in a row, as if set there intentionally. We only owned 2. 3 were lined up. Neither of us spoke. We reset the bed without looking at each other. That night the whispers began. Not words, just the sound of someone exhaling through pursed lips, long and steady. It came from above us. I stared at the beam, at the sealed box, every muscle locked. Then it stopped. The next morning, a footprint appeared in the snow outside. Barefoot, clear as if stamped in plaster, every toe, the arch, the heel. Only one. It pointed directly at the cabin. No others around it. I called Alana out. She looked at it for a long moment, then turned back inside without speaking. We drove to the general store down in town, bought firewood and groceries, neither of us saying much. The clerk watched us too long when I mentioned the cabin. "Up there?" he asked softly. When I nodded, he shook his head. "That ridge doesn't forget. Best to stay quiet after dusk." By the time we returned, the door was standing wide open. Inside, everything looked the same, except the pillows, back on the bed, stacked neatly as though they had never been moved. We tried to sleep in shifts. Alana sat with a hammer in her lap. I clutched the flashlight like it was a weapon. At 2:43 a.m., it came. A knock. Not on the door. From inside the beam above us. Hollow, deliberate. Then another. The box was breathing. At dawn we packed. As I zipped the last bag, I noticed something new. One seam in the wood had widened just enough to leak cold air. A faint draft brushed my skin. Something had shifted inside. We drove straight back to Martin. He listened without interrupting, his face pale. When I finished, he said quietly, "You heard the hollow guest." I asked what that meant. He stared out the window. "It comes to those who stay where they shouldn't. It wants to be remembered. That's why we sealed it. That's why no one lives there now." He wouldn't say more. That was 2 years ago. I never went back. But last week, after another late shift, I came home to find 3 pillows lined neatly on my apartment floor. I only owned 2. And when I looked up, I swear I felt a cold draft leaking from the seam where my ceiling meets the wall.